Home and Away airs Irene's emotional Summer Bay departure. Tonight's Home and Away sees Irene Roberts say goodbye to Summer Bay as she sets off on her tour across the world. Keep reading for our tribute to Irene's 3 decades in the Bay. After more than 32 years, Irene has left Summer Bay for the final time, as Lynn McGranger's final scenes on Home and Away aired on Australian screens this evening. She will remain on UK screens for another 6 weeks, with her final episode airing on Channel 5 on Wednesday, the 1st of October. Lynn's decision to leave the show was first announced back in February, as she prepared to embark on another nationwide theater tour of the Grandparents Club, which runs from July to October. After almost 33 years in my dream role and working every day with people who I love, respect and whom I now consider family, it's bittersweet to be closing the chapter on what has been the best and longest gig of my life, Lynn said in a statement. Her final scenes were filmed at Seven's Evely Studios on Wednesday, the 26th of March, as cast and crew of the show gathered to watch. Irene first arrived in Summer Bay back in 1991. At that point, the character was played by Jackie Phillips, but Lynn McGranger took on the role in 1993 and has remained an integral part of the show ever since. Irene's departure storyline, which was suggested to producers by Lynn herself, saw the stalwart leave for a tour of the world, wanting to make the most of her remaining time after being diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Irene only returned to Summer Bay in February, arriving home from a 6-month stint in a rehab clinic after falling off the wagon in mid-2024. Soon after her return, she began developing some concerning memory issues. Small instances of forgetfulness quickly worsened, as she revealed to John that she'd found herself in her garden in her nightie, with no idea what she was doing there. She began forgetting appointments and shifts at the diner, and at one point nearly left baby Archie home alone after forgetting that she was babysitting for Harper. After John encouraged her to seek help, Bree ran a lumbar puncture which showed signs of Alzheimer's, something which was later confirmed by a neurologist in the city. Irene has spent the last few weeks putting her affairs in order, selling her share of the Pier Diner to Leah, and writing names on the back of all of her photos, preparing herself for the day she doesn't remember the people and events immortalized in them. After a conversation with Sonny, she decided that she wanted to make the most of her remaining time before her memory failed her, and announced to her friends that she was going to travel the world while she still could. She put her house up for sale, and last week saw her sell the infamous beach house to new arrivals David and Joe. An emotional episode saw her pack up her things and say goodbye to the place she's called home since 1994. Fans were even treated to a scene outside the beach house. While scenes outside the house were commonplace in the 1990s, they gradually declined, and there haven't been any scenes at the property's exterior in more than 25 years. A new beachside location was sourced by producers, who made the unusual choice of selecting a property with no second floor. It also happened to be the same property used as Irene's former workplace, the Bayside Diner. Yesterday and today's episode saw Irene's grand farewell, as her friends hosted a real rip snorter of a party beside the beach, before saying goodbye to her forever. Theo and Justin performed, as Irene's friends danced together for one last time. John was a notable omission as he struggled with the idea of saying goodbye, but Justin eventually talked him into attending, where he delivered a touching speech in honor of the bravest woman I have ever met. Irene had one final surprise in store before she left, as she presented John with a ticket to France, and asked him to meet her at the Eiffel Tower in a few weeks. "It's not goodbye, it's au revoir," she told him, before walking off. As Irene leaves Home and Away forever, we take a look back at her more than 3 decades on the show. 1991 to 1999. Irene arrived in Summer Bay in 1991 as an alcoholic mother whose children, Finley and Damien, were living with Pippa Ross and her husband Michael. Finn had run away to Summer Bay, and Irene tracked her down, promising things would be different. Finley almost agreed to return but rejected her after discovering Irene was still drinking. Irene then tried to use her younger son Damien, who was close to Finley, to pressure Finley into coming home, Damien refused and returned to face mother and older brother Nathan alone. The following year, Damien contacted Finn for help. When Finn and Pippa visited, Irene appeared cheerful and insisted she and Damien were getting along. But she resumed bullying and beating Damien once they left. Damien ran away to Summer Bay, and Pippa refused to let Irene take him back after seeing his bruises. When Irene later returned drunk and tried to force Damien and Finn to come with her, she fell down the stairs and claimed they had pushed her. Following a conversation with Pippa, she admitted her mistakes and allowed the children to stay with Michael and Pippa while she returned home alone, maintaining sporadic contact with them. Now sober, and with Lynn having taken over the role, Irene returned to Summer Bay in the opening week of the 1993 season, after Finley was involved in a diving accident. Staying at the Ross household, Irene stepped up to help out when a heavily pregnant Pippa was forced to go and stay with her parents to rest on doctor's orders. Although Finn and Damien were wary, Irene proved her commitment by resisting temptation and supporting Finn through a stimulant addiction. Her hopes of reuniting the family were dashed when her children rejected the idea, and she left town after son Nathan was arrested back in the city. She returned a few months late and quickly won over locals, befriending Pippa and Ailsa, and starting work in Alf's shop and the Bayside Diner. Initially moving in with Adam, she supported him through his grief over Bobby's death and welcomed Nathan back from prison. But tensions rose when Nathan stole from the school, with Irene feeling she had no option but to provide the police with the evidence needed to arrest him. After losing many of her possessions in a house fire, Irene was determined to rebuild her life. She bought the beach house when Greg put it up for auction after Bobby's death, kept on existing lodgers Luke and Tug, and even convinced Finn to move in. But when Finn left for university just weeks later, Irene had to face the fact she'd missed her chance to bring the family back together. The following year saw Irene manage a local netball team, but her intense training style soon wore thin. Around this time, her rarely mentioned gift of second sight surfaced, and a test from Roxy confirmed she had high especially. She briefly tried working as a clairvoyant under the pseudonym Madame Irena, but gave it up after failing to help her first client, who was more interested in company than answers. After sensing Selena's unhappiness at home, Irene offered her a place to stay, and following a falling out with her mother, Selena moved in, the first of many teens Irene would take under her wing. Irene's singing talents were revealed for the first time towards the end of 1994, as she entered a country and western singing contest with an original song, Picking Up the Pieces. Her commitment to play Santa at the town's Christmas barbecue quickly went awry when Rob's boat broke down, forcing her to make her big entrance by being airlifted by helicopter to the beach. In 1995, Irene's love life took a brief turn when builder Mick O'Reilly proposed, only for new housemate Marilyn to discover he was already married to two different women. We later met some of Irene's extended family for the first time, when her sister Wendy McFarlane, a country and western singer, came to stay with her son Nelson. Wendy's refusal to accept her own career was dwindling initially caused tension between her and Irene, but the two made up before she and Nelson departed. Nelson returned a few months later but suffered serious burn in the car explosion that led to the Summer Bay bushfire. After he was transferred to the city, neither him nor Wendy were ever seen again. Soon after, Irene's estranged husband Murdoch, who had abandoned the family in 1985, turned up in town. For a short while it looked as though the pair were about to rekindle their marriage. But Irene sent him packing when she caught him trying to make predatory advances on Selena. When Mudd was later found murdered, Irene and Selena were interviewed as suspects, but it later emerged that Dodge, fresh from prison with a message from Nathan, had killed him. Damien made some brief returns to visit his mum in Summer Bay, impregnating Selena, who later lost the baby, and eventually made known his plans to become a priest. Damien made a final visit to Summer Bay in 1996 following Shane's death, and was never seen again. In later years we learned that Damien had settled in New Zealand, with Irene making occasional off-screen visits. Irene was touched when Selena took her surname, and she gained another ward in Chloe Richards, But Selena's life took a dangerous turn after a near-death experience led her into the orbit of cult leader Saul Bennett. Later in 1996, Finn then reappeared with an emotional request. She couldn't have children and wanted Irene to be a surrogate for her and partner Barry. Irene agreed, traveling to the US for the procedure, only for Finn to later find out she was pregnant herself. Irene also took in Saul's son Joey, despite initial mistrust. Irene later gave birth to her grandson Paul, but he was kidnapped from the hospital within hours by grieving mother Wendy Batchelor. Public appeals backfired when a tabloid sensationalized the surrogacy, and tensions grew between Irene and Finn. Saul later resurfaced to reclaim Selena and Joey and taunted Irene with claims of knowing Paul's whereabouts. Saul apparently died soon after in a fire, with Wendy's body also found but no sign of the baby, though Paul remained missing. Irene reconciled with Finn off-screen and later supported her through the birth of her second son, Mark. Irene was contacted by Father Brian Little, who encouraged her to attend church. There, she briefly comforted a baby brought by a young woman named Annie, only to later realize it was her missing grandson, Paul. She later returned to the church only to find Paul had been left for her. Initially angry that Brian had kept Annie's confession secret, she learned he had actually engineered their meeting. The two developed a close friendship, sharing mutual affection. But when Brian was called to minister after a nurse's death, Irene accepted she couldn't ask him to leave the priesthood for her. Although Irene and Finn remained close, Finn took her brother's lead and never returned to Summer Bay over the next 28 years. Irene helped organize Selena's wedding to Stephen, but Selena was kidnapped by the very much alive Saul en route to the ceremony. After her rescue and Saul's death, Selena broke things off with Stephen and went traveling. With Chloe and Lockie planning to raise baby Olivia together, Irene clashed with Lockie's manipulative mother Diana. She then took in Will Smith, who tried to drive a wedge between her and Joey so his younger siblings could move in. His lies were uncovered, and Irene convinced him to stay after learning his siblings were settled in foster care. In early 1998, when Selena contracted malaria, Irene traveled to the UK to help. Whilst having a brief holiday romance of her own, Irene engineered a reunion between Selena and Stephen, finally giving them her blessing. Irene resigned from the diner after feeling out of place with its new modernized image. And after struggling to find work, bluffed her way into a job as Donald's secretary at Summer Bay High despite lacking the skills. When Don discovered the truth, she endured a spell on the dole before he arranged secretarial classes for her, leading to a long tenure as the school's secretary while she studied part-time for an English literature degree. Her feud with Diana eased briefly when Lockie suffered brain damage, and Irene convinced Chloe, now with baby Olivia, to move back in. Will's sister Haley also joined the household. Irene joined Diana in matchmaking Chloe with Lockie's brother James, and supported Joey through a schizophrenia diagnosis. Irene and Diana's rivalry reignited during Chloe and James's relationship, with Diana spiking Irene's drink and getting her arrested. 2000 to 2009. With Will and Haley's younger brother Nick joining the fold, it wasn't long before their father Ken, also a recovering alcoholic, came on the scene. Not long after he and Irene became romantically involved, Irene was confronted in the beach house by his disturbed ex-wife Eve, wielding a cricket bat, who accused her of trying to steal her family. Irene and Ken planned to marry, but after Irene had a disturbing premonition, Ken tragically died in a garage accident shortly before the wedding. The following year, Irene returned to the UK for a short break with Will, Haley, Nick and Don for the launch of Don's book, which Haley had illustrated. 2002 saw Irene's son Nathan return to Summer Bay following his release from prison. Although things were rocky at first, Nathan came to prove himself when he helped save lives following the Summer Bay High bus crash, which saw Nick temporarily paralyzed. Nathan ended up in a relationship with Nick's nurse, Grace, and after celebrating his 30th birthday, the pair left for Alice Springs, later marrying. Irene embarked on an on-off romance with younger school principal Paris Burnett. They survived the Miragini ferry disaster together, and Paris moving away for a few months. But their relationship came to an eventual end when Paris was forced to leave to look after his orphaned niece and nephew. Irene also clashed with the manipulative Angie Russell, who had targeted Nick after he had a falling out with her son Dylan. When Angie tried to seduce Nick into lusting after her, a misunderstanding from a social worker led to Irene being wrongly suspected of abusing him. Irene then had to watch Angie frame Nick for assault, before his name was eventually cleared and Angie's lies were publicly exposed. When Angie eventually wound up dead, both Irene and Nick found themselves suspects in the investigation. Irene took in Kid Hunter, helping her overcome alcoholism, though things began to take their toll on Irene and she suffered a heart attack during an AA meeting. She later gave a home to Tasha Andrews, a withdrawn teen with a troubled past, and was stunned when it was discovered Tasha's biological mother was none other than her old enemy, Angie Russell. The arrival of new principal Barry Hyde saw Irene leave the school. After being asked to reapply for her own job, she briefly worked alongside Colleen at Flynn's surgery whilst attending uni full-time, before eventually starting work at the Beachside Diner in mid-2004. Shortly afterwards, Tasha used her inheritance money to buy Alf's share in the business as a gift for Irene, starting the beginning of a 21-year co-ownership with Leah. To everyone's surprise, Irene later began a relationship with Barry, despite their shaky start. Irene's world was shaken in 2005 when Chloe returned to town only to die in a car crash. Determined to protect Chloe's daughter Olivia, Irene opposed old foe Diana in a custody battle. She was arrested for breaking a restraining order, and Diana dragging up Irene's past resulted in her losing the case. Relief came when Chloe's will left guardianship to her ex-husband, Olivia's uncle James, with a stipulation that Diana would never be granted custody. Barry, however, had been reluctant to take on parenting again, and he and Irene split after realizing they wanted different things. Earlier in the year, Irene had served on a jury, unknowingly drawing the attention of Corey Henderson, whose father had been convicted by that jury and later died in prison. Corey came to town as a new copper and lodged with Irene, but secretly poisoned her with mercury. Irene suffered paranoia and hallucinations, and was eventually committed to a psychiatric unit. She soon realized that Corey was the culprit, and was nearly killed by poisoned chocolates before Jack Holden exposed Corey's plot and saved her life. Irene supported Tasha through involvement with the Believers cult and pregnancy after being assaulted by one of its members. She provided a home for Tasha and Robbie after their marriage, and also took in runaway Belle Taylor. Irene and Barry briefly reunited, but their relationship ended when Barry was revealed as being responsible for the death of his late wife Carrie, and the recent killing of Josh West. Distraught, Irene cut ties but later read his farewell letter, learning of his deep feelings before he left the Bay to face trial for manslaughter. Irene took in Cassie for a time, helped resolve the kidnapping of Tasha's daughter Ella, and said goodbye to Robbie and Tasha when they emigrated. Over time, Irene's household expanded to include Jeff and Annie Campbell, who she took in following their grandfather's death. In 2008, Irene became business partners with Roman Harris when the diner was forced to relocate to its current location. Later that year, she took a young boy named Oliver into her care, who transpired to be the son of Kirsty and Kane Phillips, who were still on the run. Kane's arrest and a subsequent misunderstanding led to Irene briefly being charged as his accomplice, though charges were later dropped. Eventually, Kirsty returned and took responsibility for Ollie. The following year, Irene began a romance with Lou DeBono. However, she was humiliated when Lou's wife Donna confronted her, revealing their divorce was unresolved. Although Irene ended the relationship, Lou persuaded her to holiday with him on his boat. During the trip, Lou disappeared, and Irene resorted to drink, the first time she'd fallen off the wagon since her return to Summer Bay. As the police boarded the boat after finding it adrift, a drunken Irene panicked and shot one of the officers. She was later charged with Lou's murder. While in prison, she continued drinking when Donna conspired with a prison officer to supply alcohol to her cell. After evidence proved Irene's innocence, She returned home but struggled with alcohol again, lashing out at Annie before Belle helped her into recovery. Lou's body was later discovered. Irene eventually learned Lou had been killed by people smuggler Derek Quaid. Irene endured more grief when Belle died. She supported Belle until the end and coped with the loss afterwards while continuing to provide stability for Jeff and Annie until their departures in 2010. 2010 to 2019. Irene was trapped inside the Pier Diner with Leah, Colleen and Ruby when it was set alight during a race riot, which led to the building being remodeled into the diner that still exists today. Whilst it was out of action, Irene briefly worked with a disillusioned Alf at the surf club as she helped him re-engage with the community following the riot. Irene welcomed new housemates, including sisters Bianca and April Scott, and welcomed back Will with his daughter Lily. She grew concerned by Will's behavior but supported him through a custody battle with Gypsy. When Will implicated Alf in Pen Graham's murder, which he had committed himself, Irene continued to defend Will, but turned him in when he fled. She supported April through her OCD, advised Bianca during her turbulent love life, and encouraged the community to give the Riverboys a chance. During 2011, Irene was diagnosed with breast cancer. She underwent a mastectomy and chemotherapy, initially hiding it from her friends. She struggled with the side effects and later developed heart problems, suffering another heart attack, and deep vein thrombosis. With encouragement, she began rebuilding her life and briefly got back into singing following a karaoke night at Angelo's. She entered into a brief relationship with voice coach Eddie, but ended things when it was revealed he was using her to get close to her housemate, successful recording artist Liam Murphy, and had already stolen some of his lyrics. As Bianca faced pregnancy, postnatal psychosis and relationship struggles, Irene supported her while battling her own loneliness. She took in Chris Harrington as a lodger, eventually forming a close friendship, and later housed Spencer, Sasha and Matt. She also employed Chris at the diner. Irene was caught in several crises, including the hospital bombing by Jade Montgomery. She supported Maddie following her cancer diagnosis, and also acted as matron of honor for Marilyn's wedding to John. When Chloe's daughter Olivia returned to Summer Bay, Irene took her in. When Irene discovered Olivia was self-harming and had been abused, it prompted Irene to relive her own trauma. It was revealed that as a teenager, Irene had abused by her uncle Pete, and gave birth to a child which was immediately taken from her. Confiding in Leah and Olivia, Irene soon spiraled back into alcoholism as she struggled with her past. Her drinking escalated to the point where she lashed out at Olivia, almost ran over Billy while drunk driving, and alienated her friends. Despite this, she eventually opened up about her baby and began to seek closure. After becoming one of many suspects over the death of Charlotte Kane, Irene set about trying to find her long-lost child. She was eventually approached by Claire Lewis, who believed she could be Irene's daughter. The two formed a close bond, but when Olivia secretly arranged a DNA test, it proved that they were not related. Both Irene and Claire were heartbroken, and promised to keep in touch. Despite Irene keeping a photo of Claire on her shelf right up to present day, Claire was never mentioned again. Irene was later abducted by Mick Jennings, who claimed to be her son. After 2 months in captivity, she escaped and was devastated to learn he really was her child. The ordeal left her traumatized, and although she tried to resume normal life, she struggled with panic attacks until taking self-defense classes with Billy helped her regain confidence. Shortly after Billy gave birth to baby Luke, Mick abducted her, and Irene was horrified when Billy revealed that Mick had fathered Luke after raping her. Irene persuaded Mick to hand the baby over, but learning that Luke was her granddaughter made her question her role. After being invited by Billy to be Luke's nan, despite the circumstances, she grew attached to Luke. Following Billy's death, Irene pushed for custody and clashed with Billy's partner VJ, brother Ash and Leah. Eventually she realized her fixation came from guilt over Mick, and she reconciled with Leah after a bitter falling out. Later in 2017, Mick asked Irene to speak at his parole hearing, but she told him she could not trust him to stay away from Luke. When he was released, Irene secretly paid for him to stay at a motel after he was attacked. But she admitted the truth when he was seen around town. She later ended the arrangement after he disobeyed her by leaving gifts for Luke. Mick pursued custody of Luke and stole her dummy for a DNA test. Irene supported Ash in the case and helped arrange for VJ to flee to Cyprus with Luke, just as Mick was starting the custody proceedings and applying for an injunction. Alf and Irene convinced Mick to take a job in Western Australia, telling him to build a life of his own, and Irene traveled with him briefly to help him settle. In 2018, Irene took Jasmine in as a housemate, and acted as a guide for Bella when she came to live with her. Strict rules initially caused conflict, but Irene and Bella grew close, with Irene becoming a stabilizing figure in her life. When she returned home from Robbo and Jasmine's wedding to find Bella being assaulted by Tommy O'Reilly, Irene was triggered and hit him with a vase, before bludgeoning him with a champagne bottle. After initially dumping him unconscious outside the hospital with Bella's help, Irene eventually confessed to the police. Charged with grievous bodily harm, Irene struggled with guilt, isolation and the temptation to relapse into drinking. Irene was found guilty at trial, but received a good behavior bond and counseling. Tommy later tried to sue her, forcing Irene to consider selling her house to settle, but the matter ended when he was killed by Teresa Masterson. 2020 to 2025. The past few years have mostly seen Irene continue to be a support to her friends and community. She supported Jasmine after Robbo's death, attending the funeral and inviting her to move back in. She was reunited with Leah after her captivity, gave Gemma Parada work at the diner, and comforted Jasmine when a suspected pregnancy turned out to be a phantom pregnancy. Irene was initially supportive of John dating Susie McAllister, but quickly grew suspicious of her intentions. She realized Susie had poisoned John by mistake and that the drink was actually meant for her. She then uncovered Susie's scams before being chloroformed when she confronted her. Susie fled town, and Irene was later questioned in yet another murder investigation when she turned up dead. Irene encouraged Jasmine to commit to Cash, acted as confidant to Felicity, supported Jasmine through her father's death, and met Jasmine's half-siblings Xander and Rose. She later hosted them, helped smooth over tensions with Cash, and was present when Jasmine chose not to return to the Bay. In 2022, Irene was amongst a group of people close to Marilyn who were drugged and held hostage by Heather Fraser, who revealed she was Marilyn's long-lost daughter. Irene was frustrated with Marilyn's work for Stunning Organics, and then housed John while he recovered after their bomb attack. Rumors spread that she and John were a couple, which they played along with briefly before coming clean. When John moved out, Irene felt lonely. When a tarot reading from Marilyn suggested a new path, Irene advertised for a lodger. She welcomed Harper Matheson, a social worker, and left her in charge of the house while she went to be with her, previously unheard of, granddaughter for the birth of her child. When Irene returned, she found Harper being harassed by corrupt cop detective Will Madden and learned she was hiding her sister Dana, who had been framed for stealing drugs by her ex-boyfriend and Madden. Convinced by Cash that the sisters were telling the truth, Irene agreed to help. Madden arrested Dana and tried to kill her, but Cash and Rose exposed him. Although Dana was innocent, Irene was warned she had broken the law by allowing Dana to stay. Irene was arrested and charged with obstructing the police, spending a night in a cell with Harper before being released pending sentencing. In court, supported by Harper, Dana, and John, she defended Dana's innocence and her own actions, leading the judge to dismiss the charges and also drop the case against Harper. Irene later opened up her home to Bronte Langford, who claimed to have a terminal autoimmune disease. Irene campaigned to raise money for an expensive treatment and donated to a crowdfunding page Xander had set up. Bronte also claimed illness from benzene contamination at the diner, and Irene persuaded her to sue the diner, believing the insurance would cover it. Dana warned that Bronte was being dishonest, but Irene dismissed her concerns. Eventually, it emerged that Dana was correct and Bronte had been conning everyone, leaving Irene devastated that she'd put her friends in danger. Stressed and emotionally drained by the ordeal, Irene turned back to alcohol. She began drinking openly in front of her concerned friends, gave a self-destructive interview to the Coastal News, and fell down the stairs. Harper took her to hospital, where Bree caught her swigging from a hip flask. Irene apologized and asked John to take her to rehab. After several months in rehab, Irene reluctantly returned to Summer Bay with support from Leah and John. Irene struggled after following a strict routine in rehab, relying on Dana, Leah, and Marilyn for support while avoiding John, whom she said reminded her of her lowest point. Eventually, Irene made up with John and things began to get back to normal. Until her memory issues surfaced 2 months ago, marking the beginning of the end of her time in Summer Bay. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for more movie spoilers next week. Goodbye and see you again.